The moral argument for God's existence. Ethics and morality. Ethics is a branch of philosophy that deals with questions about the nature and existence of moral values and duties, whereas morality deals with moral choices. The difference being that ethics revolves around philosophy and ideas, while morality deals with real-world, concrete choices. Values and duties should not be confused. Value is something that is good or bad. It's judgments about the worth of something. Not like it would be good for you to become a doctor, but it is not right or wrong. Duties deal with right or wrong, moral prescriptions, things that are obligatory. Moral objectivism, relativism, and sociobiological ethics are three different worldviews. Moral objectivism states that moral values and duties are objectively true despite what people believe. So, moral objectivism would say that there is a standard or a concrete truth about morality, whereas moral relativism says that moral values and duties are subjective, and opposite moral values can both be true for different individuals or societies. And sociobiological ethics says that moral values and duties have been bred into our genes through evolution, and that moral behavior patterns register in our conscience as being good because they have survival value. Now, the moral argument for God's existence states that if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God must exist. The existence of moral laws imply a moral lawgiver. Laws and duties do not exist without a lawgiver. Laws and moral standards must have an authoritative prescriber. They do not simply show up out of nowhere. Without a transcendent source, all we are left with is arbitrary absolutes. We need a measuring rod that is independent of the things measured. Proving that objective moral values exist. We can do this by our moral experience. Though it cannot be proven, there is no valid reason to deny it. Like our sense perception, it is properly basic or axiomatic. For every argument against the reliability of our moral experience, a parallel argument can be made against our sense perception. When we reflect on our moral experience, it tells us that some things are really wrong. For example, killing and torturing babies for fun. Everyone can agree that that is something that is really wrong. Value judgments become impossible to avoid. The moment you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are in fact measuring them by a standard. Moral relativism says that different cultures have different moral values, therefore there are no objective moral values. But this conclusion does not follow. Just because people have differing views on morality doesn't eliminate the existence of an objective truth about morality. What's true for you is true for you, and what's true for me is true for me. It doesn't really make sense because in order to be consistent, the relativist must agree with opposing truth, rendering his own view invalid. Now, sociobiological ethics puts science as the basis for objective morality. Survival is the ultimate value from which the other values flow. But this doesn't really make sense because survival is arbitrary since we live in a dying universe. Ultimately, survival would mean nothing because we are destined to perish, leaving no lasting mark. Sociobiological ethics commits the is-ought fallacy. Just because certain behaviors lead to furthering survival doesn't mean we have to behave or ought to behave that way. This argument draws an ought from an is, which doesn't really make sense. The word ought implies the can problem. Uh, Saying that you ought to do something says that you have the choice to or not to do this thing, and free will is inconsistent with naturalism. To conclude the moral argument for God's existence, if God does not exist, then objective moral values or duties do not exist, but objective values and duties do exist, so God has to exist. Relativism and sociobiological ethics fail to follow sound logic and bring up issues like the is ought fallacy and inconsistent living. So the moral argument for God's existence is very strong.